Hello and welcome to the third season of PrivacyCast, where we bring you the best minds across the domain of privacy and cybersecurity and make you wonder, oh boy, what am I missing on? My name is Akarsh Singh and I am your host of PrivacyCast. I am also the founder of Saro and Saro Academy, also one of the youngest people in IAPP's Asia Advisory Boards. I work a lot in privacy consulting with OneTrust Big ID tools as well as building privacy programs across industry. Today's we'll be discussing about the privacy concerns and the implications of biometric surveillance tools. And with someone who understands the privacy complications in the domain of surveillance like no one else, Mr. Ameen Jauhar. Ameen is the team lead for Center of Applied Law and Tech Research, ALTR, has spent a lot of his time in researching on AI ethics and the governance of AI. He's also a senior fellow working on the JLDI, JALDI missions engagement with the Supreme Court of India for AI and E-code committees. Handing it over to Mr. Ameen.
Thanks so much, Akarsh. It's a pleasure being here, and I'm grateful for this opportunity. Uh, as you mentioned, my name is Ameen Jauhar. I currently lead the Center for Applied Law and Technology Research, which is one of the research centers within Vidhi Center for Legal Policy. Vidhi is an independent think tank that works in undertaking legal research predominantly and working with a wide array of stakeholders, including the government and public agencies, to design better legislation and improve governance across different sectors. My own background, as you mentioned, is in law. I started as a litigator almost a decade back, and after a few years of practice with a law firm in Delhi, I sort of moved into policy advocacy and policy research. I worked actively on judicial reforms from 2015 to 2019, and since 2019 I forayed a bit more into tech policy and tech research. I have worked in the past with the Supreme Court's E committee. I continue to build independent research on issues of data governance, data protection, and of course, AI ethics and AI regulation. And it's a pleasure to be here.
And it's a pleasure to host you, by the way. So, and moving on and asking something very important that our audience wants to know, and especially people across the globe are super concerned today about surveillance. So, what I really want to ask you, because you've done so much research in the field, what I really want to ask you and also know personally from you is what are these significant privacy concerns that you see while organizations are using so much biometric surveillance? And as the technology is getting cheaper to use, what are these big privacy concerns that you see in biometric surveillance technologies?
So, when we say biometric surveillance, I'm going to sort of contextualize it with two main kinds of systems that are currently very prevalent. One is facial recognition, and something that is more nascent and recent. It's also called emotion recognition. These are two systems which predominantly work as biometric applications or algorithms that process sensitive personal data of individuals to fundamentally predict a match between an existing database or an existing visual image with an active or live visual recording or capturing of footage or something like that. So it's essentially it can, yeah, that's the broad functionality of any of the either of these tools. Facial recognition is more about mapping your face and certain unique features of it, which is where it captures like your biometric elements like your iris scan, etc., and so on and so forth. Emotion recognition is even more sort of arcane in its usage. It's literally like it is designed fundamentally on the idea that we have certain emotional reactions that are unconscious but sort of depict how we are going through or what kind of thoughts are going in our process. So it's a bit more, I would say, as I said, arcane and mystical. uh, in terms of concerns, I would say that privacy is obviously, I think, the concern that gets a lot of hue and cry around it, because it is, you are fundamentally allowing the processing of something that is not just personal information but sensitive personal information, and can cause irreparable damage to an individual if it is either stolen or misused or just illegally procured, or even if it is sourced like accurately. You never, like, if the processing is not for the purpose for which an individual has consented, then it sort of fundamentally vitiates your right to privacy. But with facial recognition particularly, or these kind of biometric surveillance tools, I think there are like three broad issues when you talk about it in the surveillance context. One is your legal or constitutional issues, which is where your privacy particularly features. Along with privacy, there are also concerns about how surveillance, especially when mass surveillance takes place, it can somehow vitiate or have a chilling effect on your free speech as an individual. And also, because there are concerns around accuracy or targeted surveillance, it can vitiate what under Article 14 is called the right to equality in India, that you can't target an individual or treat someone unfairly in a legal process or under a legislation, unless there is arbitrarily, at least. So these are the three sort of rights, legally speaking, which are at risk. But beyond that, there are also ethical and design concerns in these technologies, which, as I mentioned, are basically like there's enough sort of documented research at this point which shows that, one, like any other data driven algorithm, facial recognition or emotion recognition tools can have a high propensity of producing inaccurate results. In fact, like, there are concerns, the fact that in a lot of surveillance capacities where it's used by police forces, etc., a 70 to 80% accuracy rate is considered to be high accuracy and is considered to be like the gold standard. Whereas you have certain algorithms which are used where accuracy is as low as 5 to 10%, and it is still it's still been deployed. So those accuracy concerns change with the kind of data that is being fed into it, the kind of proxies that are being fed into the design of the algorithm, and so on and so forth. So that is another concern that exists. Also, there is the fact that since we are talking about surveillance, and a lot of surveillance happens in the context of the criminal justice system and policing and law enforcement, at least in India right now, it is not something that the law, say something like the Evidence Act, for instance, does not consider how algorithmic output or how predictive output is to be used in a criminal trial. And this is no longer theoretical purely. Like, there have been reports from the last year where the Delhi police is sort of, now utilizing it in not just identifying, but also prosecuting individuals in the cases from 2020 in the Delhi riots case. So this is no longer like hypothetical, but these are the three broad constraints that are there.
Because we're talking about this, and you rightly pointed out a few days back, I also heard a news, and it was a news that the police in the UK asked the Amazon's Alexa to kind of tell them they solve a murder case. So are you well versed with that? And where what happened is that the 3 days of recording, right? The 3 days of recording in the house was available at Alexa. Amazon was recording it, and they also provided it for the case. Like, not just recording it, they are recording everything, and they also have recording from the past. Wherever there is Alexa device, so they're also recording and keeping it. So again, I'm not here to comment on a specific company or something, but anything that is around us. And a lot of times we're discussing, hey, I was talking about something, and then I saw an ad.
Yeah.
Can you also like point something around that?
I mean, there is this general sort of concern around how, like, conventional. So, at least in legal theory, when you talk about privacy, there is this idea that if my privacy has to be vitiated, I should consent to it, and I should consent in a completely understanding that this is some information that is being extracted from me, or I'm voluntarily handing it over, and it will be used for ABCD purposes. This is what is called informational autonomy, that you have autonomy over your personal information, how it is to be collected, how it is to be processed, if it is to be shared further ahead. And the idea in most legal or regulatory frameworks, when they talk about data protection, is to sort of give, at the very, like, in its very fundamental sense, basically is to reinforce this consent and notice idea, that an individual is put to notice and then they consent to data collection, data processing, and only based on that consent and for the specific purposes listed in that consent can your data be processed. That's the core principle that any data protection regime at present tends to sort of agree to and conform with. But when you talk about things like the case you mentioned, where there is Alexa, or what we generally call as Internet of Things, like it can be any of these, like your Apple Watch, which genuinely like monitors so much of your activity on a daily basis. These are issues where this idea of very traditional consent and notice becomes very diluted. Just to give you a very brief quick example, is there are these kind of smart doorbells these days that are now being put up. Now an individual who is installing them in their house may have consented to that. Okay, you know what, I have a smart doorbell, I consent to like the doorbell recording. I go to my friend's place, I don't realize that there's a smart doorbell, I just roll and like say the doorbell is taking my facial scan in that moment, etc. I don't know where that data is, like if it's some, say, like American product, if it's being put in some American server in San Francisco where my personal biometrics are being stored. I never consented to. Like my friend never signed, like or told me that, oh, by the way, there's a smart doorbell. Do you consent to your thing being recorded, etc. So on and so. So just to give you an example, that Internet of Things really dilutes this idea of conventional consent and notice, which is something that is actually a real issue. A lot of legal theories are trying
And
to sort of grapple with.
I also wanted to add on to that. So my relative, like, I stay a lot of time in Netherlands, and in my house there, we have this smart doorbell. But I'll tell you something interesting. So see, the data going to America is right. I'm not very concerned about that personally, even being an Indian. But the doorbell is Chinese. So I am concerned that, and when I look back into the server of the data, and I tried seeing, where the data is going and where these servers are, where this smart doorbell is actually using the brains of, and it pointed out to Chinese servers, and I was a bit shocked over there. So I'm just, just adding on to your point.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the point is that if someone, say for instance, is also comfortable with the idea of such China's servers storing it, I share your concerns, one, just for the record. But if say somebody's comfortable, that is a choice that they need to have, and that is information. So in your traditional understanding of informational autonomy, that is all information that needs to be there for the person, and they need to consent to that before data is collected and processed or stored, because all those are aspects of like your right to privacy and how I have autonomy over how my data
And
is to
I'm
be collected and
totally,
stored.
and I'm totally with you. And I was also thinking, while you were saying, I was also thinking that what could have been a solution to this. And there is one new concept that Microsoft came out with. They said that in, I think, 2023 or 2024, they will 100% become data sovereign. So Microsoft is trying to attain data sovereignty in EU. So now their structure of the EU map of all the Microsoft services will be hosted in EU, will be services will be provided in EU. So at least data is not, I'm just giving an example of EU right now that Microsoft is trying to achieve that. But once an organization like Microsoft achieves that, it also gives some context that, something can happen in India, in UAE, in Saudi, all these countries, they are all getting more and more conservative with the data, and especially because, as you mentioned, because of biometrics, right? So a software in the US is working. So I feel like there is answer to this, a data sovereignty, but I still feel that sensitive PII like biometrics, and I keep
Yeah.
asking my students, right, that do you think a photograph is PII or SPII, right? It
Hmm.
depends, right, what you're extracting out of it.
Yeah.
So it's great to hear your views on that. So
Yeah.
moving on, I have one more question to you before we end the day. The current draft of the Indian privacy law, right? The Indian privacy law that is upcoming is highly dependent on consent, but will also and does not talk about sensitive personal data. So all the data is treated singularly. So what do you think that in terms of aspects of biometric data, mass surveillance, whatever is happening in India right now, also and will happen in 2 3 years down the line. So how do you see, right? Do you want to support some additions to that? Do you think some additions should be done there in terms of aspects to take security and biometric data?
I will try to be brief because this is a very contentious point right now. And I'll try to be brief and try to keep my legal jargon simple. But basically, I think there are a few key concerns. This data protection bill that was published last year in December, there are one thing, as you already mentioned, one, it has completely done away with the concept of sensitive personal data. Now, that has had certain sort of, it's had a domino effect on certain, because the earlier draft had talked about sensitive personal data, and it wasn't just defining it, it was basically creating extra precaution for processing of that data, and it was also prohibiting in certain conditions the processing of that data. Just to give an example, one key prohibition was that for employment purpose you cannot process sensitive personal information. How this would pan out in a real life scenario is, as you must be aware, a lot of private sector corporations, including law firms, have now become like, they've mainstreamed the idea of having like a fingerprint attendance register. That's a biometric scan, or an iris scan. Things that we used to see in the 90s movies and CIA and all those like sci-fi movies are becoming mainstream in regular corporate places. Under the 2019 bill, given that sensitive personal data cannot be processed for employment purposes, this would have been banned. And my opinion is that biometric surveillance within the private sector needs to be a no no. And I'll tell you why. Surveillance is predominantly what you would in legal terms call a sovereign function. It is the function of the state. And even with the state, it has to be done with ample checks and balances and oversight. It cannot be something like, recently, 2 years back, we had this Pegasus judgment, uh, where the then Chief Justice very eloquently said that national security can't be this sweeping defense that you give as a carte blanche for the government to do anything and everything and just say that everything is happening in hushes and hush and everything. So with this DPDP bill, this deletion of sensitive personal data is one very problematic. The second thing is this idea of deemed consent that they seem to have inserted. Now, this is again, they are trying to say it's deemed consent, because in law there is this idea that deemed anything is you creating a legal fiction that it is assumed to be that. But what it does is provide 8 or 9 different situations where there is essentially non-consensual data processing that is being legitimized. That completely does away with any tenets of consent based processing. One, two, those categories are very broad. Like, so one of those categories is actually law enforcement. It says that for the prevention or investigation or prosecution of a crime or any violation of law. Now, crime would be one thing. Any violation of law could also include civil violations. It could include contractual violations. To prevent that, you can basically create like a carte blanche for people to investigate. So it's a tricky sort of system that they're trying to. One, they're going against a fundamental tenet, which is basically legitimizing non-consensual data processing, which sort of literally flies in the face of your right to privacy. Now, even if you were to argue that right to privacy is not absolute and there are restrictions, there is a test that the Supreme Court has laid down very clearly, and one element of that is proportionality of a measure when the state has to vitiate your right. And it can only be the state, it cannot be a private entity vitiating. So for private entity, that exception doesn't exist. For the state, it does. And where the state does, it has to prove that, this is the only way they can do it. This is the only effective way they can curtail this. And that is to be used in very exceptional cases. Giving these sweeping sort of classes of non-consensual data processing is extremely problematic. And it will only go on to sort of further trends of like mass surveillance that are already there. So I will keep it to that, but these 2 points, in my opinion, are like significant sort of concerns in the current draft, which will really create a lot of problem even for the state to sort of retain control over surveillance. Like, the state needs to have that authority and should be the only entity that can exercise that authority. It cannot be any restaurant trying to surveil its customers or an RWA trying to surveil its residents.
Yeah, and I think I'm very cognizant with your thoughts, by the way, and also I feel that the way you have put this through, right, kind of, I hope somebody in the government is also listening and takes the right decision before the draft becomes a bit also add in a few more things. Carte blanche to anything doesn't make sense. And for a country like India, we need to have sector-wise laws and we need to have data governance laws, right? So, and we are missing, highly missing on that. EU already is getting ahead and has already passed laws around AI. And India being the technology hub, we are not even talking about that, right? Data is free. So I think as a human being, I think it's very interesting to remember that the US still doesn't have privacy as a human right, but India has. And when we have that, it has to be respected. And also, I would like to kind of come to the end of this session and thank you for an amazing session. And also, when we talk about surveillance, when we talk about, a lot of times, even as privacy professionals, we're not thinking in depth. So what you have, kind of came to the session and you have spoken up. I also feel you have just changed my perspective. So thank you for that. And I hope the same has happened for all our listeners. And to all my listeners, please, if you feel like you want to listen something around this or you want to know more about Mr. Amin, drop it in the comments and we will come back to you. And Mr. Amin, over to you for a short thank you note.
That was a very kind sort of summation of the session. But no, I agree. Like we had considered certain different questions, but I'm glad this conversation went around a bit on like IoTs, and I think it's important. Like for me, it was good to have like these real life scenarios. As a lawyer, I think we struggle to sort of explain our legal arguments by contextualizing it to actual situations where they are likely to unravel and pan out. And having this kind of a platform is obviously very fruitful in that regard. So thank you again for having me, and I would be
It's
really
a privilege
interested.
to have you,
Yes,
Amin, and to everyone, guys. Just in another 1 week, you will have another episode with another speaker. So please stay subscribed to the channel, and we will be together.